Okay, this is just a thought going out to those of you who believe in the concept of a universal mind. Those of you who believe that we're all one consciousness, that this is like a little focal point connected to this massive, infinite consciousness that some people call God. Okay? And my thought is this. Imagine the universe was never created. Imagine this universal consciousness never divided itself up, never became isolate self-consciousness, one thing distinct from another in the way that we experience consciousness. Imagine that never happened. Imagine it just always stayed in this eternal moment of infinite awareness. There's nothing but God. There's nothing but infinite consciousness that knows everything, that sees the future from the past. Imagine there was nothing else but this. Now, here's my thought. If God is like that, then what is God conscious of? You know what I'm getting at? If there's nothing other than infinite consciousness, what has it got to be aware of? Is it even aware? Think about it. Make the comparison even between the idea of infinite consciousness and the awareness of a child in the womb, which is probably not quite zero, but because it may hear certain sounds, but it's almost zero. It's not stimulated by anything, so it's not really starting to have an awareness until it becomes aware of something other than itself. In other words, the outside world, when it's born. When she is born, I should say. So, what is the awareness of God if there's nothing to be aware of? Does not the very idea of awareness presuppose subject and object? So here we're maybe getting to the idea, and this is theoretical and it's intuitive, but work with me here. It's almost like without creation, God is nothing. At least that is if we define God in terms of a mind. And this is where I start to realize something. Maybe when we're using the term mind or universal mind, or even the term consciousness, maybe we're anthropomorphizing God. Okay, there's a big massive word. And I've used it once or twice before, but you almost need to define it every time you use it. But it's really important. An anthropomorphism is when you attribute the faculties of man to God. In other words, when you see an event, when you look at an event and you say, oh, that was the hand of God, you know that God doesn't have a hand, but you're using this terminology in order to try and understand a fraction of something that is ultimately beyond your understanding, because it's infinite. It doesn't belong to this cause-effect universe. It's transcendent of all this. So we don't know what God is, and yet we define God as a mind. But when we do that, are we not guilty of making God in our image? Because man has a mind, therefore God shall have a mind. And I'm not saying God is somehow mechanistic or less than aware, but what I'm saying is, surely he must be more than a mind. He, she, it, whatever. But that, if I define that something as a conscious entity, a being in the way that I perceive me as a being, then what I'm doing is I'm limiting what that thing is. If I call it infinite consciousness even, I'm limiting it to something like me, because I am conscious. So whatever it is, it's, I don't know, trans-conscious, is that the word? Something more than conscious? Because if we define it purely as consciousness, we have to ask the question, what is it conscious of in eternity if there was no universe? Then it's conscious of nothing. And if it's conscious of nothing, then it's not conscious. So, this may all sound very, very sort of, like, well, what difference does any of this make to the practicalities of everyday life? But ultimately, it's your philosophy of life that dictates so much about your own behaviour. So that's why I place importance on wrapping my head around these things as best I can. So I think it's time to stop using the word infinite consciousness and maybe to start just simply using the term the infinite, or the source, or the transcendent, the eternal, the whole. But to call it infinite consciousness, to call it a universal mind, that's just limiting it. And when you understand that you can't limit the transcendent, then you realize that you're never going to wrap your head around what this thing is. You're always just going to scratch the surface of it. And when you read things in the Bible like, God smiting his people and, opening up the ground underneath them and stuff and getting angry and jealous, all this stuff is God made in man's image. It has to be. Just look at it. Why would a being that is beyond space and time, if it even is a being, because there I am anthropomorphizing by using that term, why would the infinite be jealous? And even to say that it's jealous is just to limit it as a creature, because jealousy is a faculty of a creature. And this is where I start to realize that the Christian depictions of God are really just these very, very crude metaphors of something that we can understand in a deeper way today than perhaps they could back then. But I think the important thing to do is to not mistake the metaphor for the reality. I am generally disliked by Christians because of my rejection of the Bible. But I think I have a far deeper and far more profound apprehension of what God is than most of them do.